Part 3. Jamie had an easier time with the weight than the mech warrior. Clearly distracted by her need to get to her brother, the warrior who Jamie learned was named Leah was restless. Even though they both knew it was risky, Leah kept creeping up to the window of the metal siding of the building to see if her brother was alright. Maybe he got out and away before, Jamie said, trying to find some way to console an increasingly frustrated Leah. There were Falcon helicopters and drones all over the place, and the two fighters were trapped inside the dilapidated building. The lack of gunshots was promising, but if Leah's brother and the others didn't find a way to put some space between them and their destroyed mechs, capture, interrogation, and execution would likely follow. Leah tugged on a strand of her short black hair in a nervous habit. She wanted to be out of there. She needed to find out if her brother was okay. "Why were you out there?" Leah asked. "My unit was wiped out during an ambush attempt up in Arbery Pass. I managed to make it out and walked here," Jamie responded. Leah did the math in her head before saying, "That's one heck of a long walk." "Why were you out here?" "I didn't even know the Resistance had any mechs left," Jamie said with a raised eyebrow. Leah looked at Jamie for a few moments before responding. "There were big things going on. And if you're who you say you are, that should be enough for now." Realizing that she wasn't fully trusted by the mech warrior, Jamie nodded and accepted the vague explanation. Jamie sat with her back against the machinery, trying not to think about her empty stomach. The growling felt selfish considering what Leah was dealing with, so Jamie suffered in silence. Eventually, there was a rumbling nearby, and several large salvage trucks arrived on the scene to start loading the incapacitated mechs. Shadowhawk 2C was first, followed by the rebel mechs. Leah wanted to leap from the window and rush to her battle mech, but it would have been futile. The feeling of being dispossessed weighed heavily on her, and she slumped down against the metal wall under her window. Several more hours passed, night descended, and both the rebel warriors felt the cold begin to bite. With no sign of Falcons for several hours, they decided to make a run for it. Leah said there was a rebel network hub nearby. If anyone from the fight made it out, they would be there. The pair gathered their courage and slid out of the building into the twists and turns of alleyways between the commercial and light industrial buildings. Jamie was impressed by Leah's demeanor once they were out there, and she felt reassured that the mech warrior seemed to know where she was going. Jamie had been in the city before, but not enough to know the area. They continued to creep along for several miles before reaching an industrial complex that looked bombed out. Jamie couldn't see many hints of activity. She did spot a couple of impressions in the dirt outside of a tall warehouse building that could have been from a bottleneck, but as she turned her head, Leah's grip was around her collar, slamming her up against the side of the factory door. "What's your unit ID?" Leah demanded. 421st Light Infantry, Jamie stuttered out a response, shocked by the serious look on Leah's face. The questioning continued when Leah asked, "Who's your commanding officer?" Jamie responded, "Lieutenant Tion and Captain Hicks back at the depot. Please, I'm one of you, I swear." "What's your favorite food?" Leah asked, while still holding Jamie's collar tight. That question caught Jamie off guard. She pondered it for a second before responding. "Garlic pork buns. My mom used to make them all the time when I was little, before..." Jamie's voice trailed off, and eventually Leah released her grip. "We'll get you checked out. Hang out here for a second," Leah said, before sliding into the barely open hangar door. Jamie looked back towards the warehouse, wondering if the surviving rebel battle mech made it back here. She hoped for Leah's sake that her brother had been able to get away. After a couple of minutes, Leah re-emerged, grabbed Jamie by the hand, and led her into the factory. The inside of the factory wasn't in any better condition than the outside. Much of the machinery was clearly broken, wrecked by some event years ago. It's possible that it occurred during the Falcon invasion. The pair made their way through the wrecked steel, unspooled wire, and burnt conveyor belts to a staircase leading down, which was concealed by some well-placed armor plating. Entering the bunker was like walking into a new world. It consisted of concrete, artificial white light, and an incredibly serious tone. Jamie immediately felt way out of her depth as she walked into a communications room where there were banks of computers, television screens, and many busy-looking people in various types of military clothing. At the center of it all was a rather stern-looking man with chestnut skin, gray hair, and an officer's uniform that looked like it had seen decades of use. "What's the ETA on that Steiner insertion team? We're on our heels here, and I don't like it. That little hiccup in the timetable cost us in mechs and mech warriors. Don't stop messaging till you have an answer from those bastards." The officer bellowed before his steely gray eyes fell onto Jamie and Leah waiting at the entrance. "Get in here, Leah. I need a debrief." Leah walked forward, still holding Jamie's hand for a few moments in order to pull her in as well. She straightened, still clad in her coolant vest, and said, "That Falcon patrol was early. They're breaking all their set patterns. I ran across a fighter who said that her unit was nearly wiped out in a routine mountain ambush. Sir, something isn't cool here." Leah paused, building up some strength to continue. "I lost my commando. I fear that Jay and his are gone as well. I saw his mech fall, but I don't know if they grabbed him or even if he survived." "I think I can help with that." A voice from the left sent Leah's head on a swivel. All sense of professionalism and decorum went out the window as she leapt into her brother's arms. He winced as he was still dealing with some injuries that he sustained from the battle, but he held her up. Jamie smiled, feeling a bit of relief after what felt like a week of miserable failure. A tall man with a dark complexion and curly black hair stood quietly next to their embracing siblings for a moment, but then he stepped forward. With a rather annoyed tone, he said, "So we're down to my Valkyrie and 2 dispossessed. What did that earn us? Where are these Steiners, Major?" "Intel says there was an error in the timecodes for launch. We're trying to sort out when the insertion team will be inbound," Major Washing replied as he glanced over a bank of busy comms officers. "So we lost Sarah and Mia because of a comms hiccup? That's bullshit," the man bellowed. Jamie's heart ached for the mech warrior as it was clear that he was feeling the pain of his lost comrades. Leah stepped away from Jay and gave the man a hug before saying, "I know it hurts, but we're so close to the win here, Emil. We all accepted the risks of that mission, and we did put a hurt on the birds." Emil shook his head and looked down at Leah before responding. "Not even your boundless optimism can make up for the fact that we're now combat ineffective. You took down a Shadowhawk, but they nearly wiped us out. How long before the birds have repaired their loss while we don't even have our mechs?" Leah sighed, stepped away, and turned towards Major Washing. One of the comms officers called out, "We have video feed from the starport. Lance 2 and 3 are engaged with the Falcon security forces." "Put it up on the screen," Major Washing said as the whole room focused on the bank of monitors. With some tinkering to reduce static, a distant panoramic shot of the spaceport came into view across the bank of monitors on the concrete wall. There was no audio, but it was possible to pick out the battle mechs approaching along with some light vehicles and infantry. Fire from the security walls and fencing was light at first, and the mechs made short work of most of the outer perimeter. However, as the 8 battle mechs advanced onto the tarmac and runway, sustained pulse laser fire cut through the air. A couple of the lighter mechs crumpled under the intense shots, and the remaining began to move quickly toward the source. When Leah saw the Turkina step out from the large mech bay, she gasped. No one in the room had ever seen an assault mech on the planet before. How the Falcons had managed to bring one down to the surface without anyone knowing is a question left unanswered as the medium and light mechs of the rebel forces started to scatter. They did fire on the 95-ton battle mech, but it seemed to shrug off the fire with only minor damage, as it quickly was joined by another pair of battle mechs that Jamie did recognize as a Blackhawk and a Black Lanner. "Where are the Steiner dropships? They're supposed to be arriving at the same time," Emil screamed. Leah turned away, seeking solace in her brother's arms as the rest of the room watched in horror as the fellow rebels were systematically cut down. A Wasp nearly made it to the hole that they blew in the defense fencing, but the stomping Turkina hit it with the LB-20X shot that ripped its leg and torso apart. It cartwheeled and ended up sprawling across the opening. A brave Clint stood its ground, seeking to distract the clan's mechs, while others made their escape. It leveled its AC-5 at the Blackhawk, and it fired it along with its 2 medium lasers. The autocannon rounds stitched up the Falcon mech, causing it to stumble. Jamie watched in disbelief as the Blackhawk recovered and began to chain fire its ER medium lasers into the Clint. The rebel mech recoiled, nearly toppling as each laser seemed to compound the damage from the previous shot. The armor glowed white-hot, then began to slough off of the Clint entirely. By the time the Blackhawk had finished the chain, the Clint was a crumbling scrap. The 3 Falcon battlemechs now dominated the center of the spaceport. Backing up to one another, they seemed to revel in the opportunity to cut down the disorganized and fleeing rebel forces. Through the smoke and silent explosions on the screen, the occupants of the bunker were frozen in shock. They were unexpectedly watching the destruction of organized resistance on the planet. Major Washing shook his head, turned away from the screens, and smashed his fists into the table, covered in maps and printed intel. After so many years of fighting, this opportunity to work with the Steiners to liberate the planet was a ray of hope. Now it appeared to be the final nail in their coffins. Jamie's mouth opened and closed as she tried to come up with something to say. None of this made sense. From her unit's destruction to this ambush at the spaceport, the Falcons seemed to know about everything ahead of time. Jamie knew that her knowledge of the situation was limited, but she still felt compelled to ask. What if there are no Steiner forces? What? Leah said, turning towards Jamie. What if there are no Steiner forces? What if it was a ruse to lure us out? Jamie said, suddenly feeling the eyes of the room turn towards her. One of the comms officers bristled and responded, We've been in contact with the Steiner jump ship for months. All this intel is certified and checked out. Emil cut in, stepping up to the table and placing his hand on the cold metal surface. Not there for support, but more to underline his next words. He said, 3 incidents, 3 times we've been had with no sign of Steiner help. Yeah, we've been had. The Falcons used our desire for hope against us. Major Washing crossed his arms and closed his eyes while he searched for any evidence in his memory to contradict this claim. All the instructions they received were from the higher-ups and from scrambled comms. There was nothing he could think of that could actually prove the jump ship they were talking to was Steiner. He sighed and cut the chatter in the room when he said, Get me Central Command, if they still exist. This is the end of Part 3. Thank you for listening. I hope you're enjoying the story as it evolves here. If you want to support the creation of this and future content, I'd really appreciate a like and a subscribe. Take care, be safe, be awesome, and I'll see you next time.